3 weeks before the bank in Harlan County, Kentucky sent its final notice to the farm on Redbird Creek Road, the temperature dropped to 7 degrees and stayed there. The winter of 1959 arrived in the Cumberland Mountains the way hard winters always did. Not with a single storm, but with a slow, grinding accumulation of cold that settled into the hollows like something that had decided to stay. Snow came on the 3rd of December and did not entirely leave. Ice formed on the creek by the 10th. By Christmas, the road past the old Dillard place was a channel of frozen mud and tire ruts that made travel a matter of will rather than convenience. And most people in that part of Harlan County had already decided their will could wait until spring. Harlan County in 1959 was not a place that asked for pity, and did not receive much. The coal seams that had employed 2 generations of men from Evarts to Cumberland were thinning in some places and played out in others, and the companies that had come in from Ohio and Pennsylvania decades before had begun the slow, quiet business of deciding which mines were worth the cost and which were not. The county seat carried a population of just over 3,000, and the rural roads that branched off the main highway into the creek hollows and up the ridge faces carried a few hundred more, families who had worked the land between coal contracts, or raised cattle on the thin pasture, or kept kitchen gardens through the summer against the long winters. The county had 2 banks. The larger one, First National Bank of Harlan, occupied a brick building on the main street with a marble lobby and a president named Chester Aldridge, who had held that position since 1941. The smaller bank, Citizens Savings, had closed in 1955, which meant that for anyone in the county who needed to borrow money or hold a mortgage, Chester Aldridge's institution was the only door in the room. The land itself was specific in the way mountain land always is: steep, beautiful, particular. The ridges ran northeast to southwest, in long parallel folds, and between them the creeks cut narrow valleys, where the soil was dark and productive in the bottomland, but thin and rocky on the slopes. A farm that straddled both, some bottomland for hay and garden, some ridge for timber and cattle range, was a working proposition if the person working it understood the terrain and was willing to answer to it. The Dillard place on Redbird Creek was that kind of farm. 47 acres in total, 11 of them bottomland along the creek, the rest climbing the south-facing ridge behind the house. There was a house, a barn in fair condition, a smokehouse, a chicken coop, and a root cellar that had been there since before living memory. The deed had been held by one family for 31 years. Her name was Clara Dillard. She was 39 years old in December of 1959, and she had been a widow for 14 months. Clara Dillard, born Clara May Combs in Leslie County in 1920, had come to Harlan County as a young woman of 19 when she married Thomas Ray Dillard in the late summer of 1939. She had brought with her a cedar hope chest, a cast-iron skillet that had belonged to her grandmother, and a quality of practical attention, a capacity for noticing what needed doing and then simply doing it, that would define her entire adult life. Thomas had brought the farm itself, inherited from his father, who had inherited it from his. The Dillard family had cleared the original 47 acres by hand in 1903 and planted the apple orchard on the low ridge that still bore fruit each September. Thomas Dillard had worked the mine at Benham through the 1940s, the way most men in that county moved between farming and coal. The mine for cash wages, the farm for the deep security of something that could not be taken away by a company's quarterly report. He and Clara had built a life in that movement between the two, and the life had been modest and sufficient, and, by the measure of the Cumberland Mountains in that era, fortunate. They had 2 children, daughter Ruth, born in 1942, who by 1959 was 17 and attending Harlan High School, son James, born in 1946, 13 years old and in the 8th grade at Kaywood School, a boy who already had his father's way of moving through the world, deliberate, unhurried, watchful. The mortgage on the Dillard farm had been taken out in 1951, when Thomas had needed to replace the barn after a winter collapse and repair the root cellar after a flood undermined its foundation. He had borrowed $2,100 from First National Bank of Harlan at 5% interest over 15 years. By October of 1958, the outstanding balance stood at $940. 14 years of payments, made on time every month without a single exception, had reduced the debt to that number. Thomas Dillard died on the 22nd of October, 1958. He was driving back from Cumberland on a 2-lane road when the steering on the truck failed. A broken tie rod, the state police said. And the truck left the road on a left curve and went down the embankment into Clover Fork. He was 42 years old. He was dead when the first car stopped. Clara received the news by telephone from the county hospital at 5 in the afternoon. She sat down in the kitchen chair by the stove and did not move for a long time. And then she got up and made supper for her children, because it was supper time and they needed to eat. What followed were 14 months that Clara Dillard would not describe as hard, because hard was a word that implied something different than what those months were. They were simply the months in which she learned the exact dimensions of what she was facing and made her accounting of what she had to work with. Thomas had carried a modest life insurance policy through the mine union, $1,200, which Clara received in December of 1958. She put $400 into the checking account for operating expenses and used $600 to pay the funeral costs and kept $200 in an envelope in the cedar chest. She made the November and December mortgage payments on time. She made the January payment in 1959 and the February payment and the March payment. She took in washing from 3 families in the area. She sold eggs from the 31 chickens she kept, and she sold the extra milk from the 2 cows, and in June she sold 4 of the cattle Thomas had been running on the ridge, receiving $160 for them, and she put that money against the mortgage. By September of 1959, 1 year after Thomas's death, the outstanding balance on the farm mortgage had been reduced from $940 to $710. Clara had done this through absolute precision. She had spent nothing that was not necessary. She had kept the farm running. She had kept her children in school and in shoes. Then October came, and with it 2 things that arrived together and were not survivable separately. The washing work ended first. One family moved to Ohio. The husband had found work at a plant in Dayton, and 2 others consolidated their laundry with a machine they bought together, splitting the cost between neighbors, as people in that hollow had always managed large expenses. Clara lost $40 a month in income in the span of 3 weeks. Then James cut his leg on a piece of farm equipment in the last week of October, a deep laceration across the back of his calf that the county hospital cleaned and stitched, 17 stitches, and treated against infection, and the bill came to $91. The county hospital did not offer payment plans to rural families that fall. The hospital bill was due in 30 days. Clara looked at her ledger. She kept a ledger, a green-covered composition book in which every dollar in and every dollar out was entered in her careful, even handwriting, and she understood the arithmetic. She could pay the hospital or she could pay the November mortgage payment. She could not do both. She paid the hospital. She wrote to Chester Aldridge at First National Bank of Harlan on the 5th of November, 1959, explaining the situation in 1 page of clear, direct language. She described Thomas's death, the 14 months of maintained payments, the lost washing income, the medical bill. She asked for a single month's forbearance, the right to skip the November payment and add it to the end of the loan. She wrote the letter at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, by the light of the single lamp, and she read it through twice before she sealed the envelope. Chester Aldridge's reply came 9 days later. It was a single paragraph. The bank's policy did not allow for modifications to existing mortgage terms. Any missed payment would initiate the default process per the terms of the original note. A late fee of $12 would be assessed for any payment not received by the 15th of the month. Clara read the letter standing at the mailbox in the gray November afternoon, and then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and walked back to the house. She went to the bank in person on the following Tuesday, driving the 23 miles on icy roads. She sat in Chester Aldridge's office, a man in his mid-50s with a careful suit and careful language, who was not unkind but was very clear, and she laid out the same information she had put in the letter and asked again for the single month's forbearance. Aldridge explained that the board of directors set policy, and he did not make exceptions. He said this with evident regret that was not sufficiently motivating to produce any different outcome. Clara asked who was on the board. Aldridge gave her the names. She wrote them in her composition book. She went to see two of them the following week, a hardware store owner named Buford Creech and a mine superintendent named Harold Watts. Buford Creech told her the board operated on consensus and he couldn't act alone. Harold Watts was not available. His secretary said he was in a meeting and could not be disturbed. The December payment came due on the 1st. Clara had $63 in the account. The payment was $82. She was $19 short, and she had no place left to go. The final notice arrived on the morning of January the 8th, 1960. It informed Clara Dillard that as of the 1st of January, the mortgage on the property at Redbird Creek Road, Harlan County, Kentucky, was in default. The bank would initiate foreclosure proceedings on the 15th of February unless the outstanding balance of $741.16, the original balance plus 3 months of accumulated penalties and fees that had accrued during the collection process, was paid in full by that date. The notice was signed by Chester Aldridge, President. $741.16. Clara stood at the kitchen table and read the number twice, and then wrote it in the green ledger with the date. Then she put the letter in the drawer where she kept important papers, and she went out to feed the chickens because they needed feeding. She had not told the children. Ruth had noticed something was wrong. 17-year-old girls notice everything. But she had not asked directly, and Clara had not offered. James was still walking with a slight limp from the leg, but the wound had healed clean, and he was back to carrying his half of the farm work without complaint. Clara looked at her children at supper on the 8th of January and understood, with the cold clarity of a person who has run out of options, that she was going to lose their home in 38 days. That was the situation as it stood when a man named John Wayne came to Harlan County. He was not there for the Dillard farm. He was not there for Clara. He did not, in those first days, know that either one existed. John Wayne had come to Harlan County, Kentucky, in the second week of January 1960, at the invitation of his friend and occasional collaborator, Andrew V. McLaglen, who was scouting locations for a production that might use the eastern Kentucky mountains as exterior backdrop. The project never materialized in that form, but the invitation had been issued, and Wayne was between commitments in that particular January, and he had a habit, formed over 30 years of working in places that were not Hollywood, of going to a place when it was offered, on the theory that the place itself was usually more interesting than whatever had been planned for it. John Wayne in January of 1960 was 52 years old and had been one of the most recognizable men in America for a generation. He stood 6 feet 4 inches and carried 230 pounds on a frame that had not entirely softened, despite the years behind a desk and in front of a camera. His face was the face the world knew, the square jaw, the deep-set eyes with their habitual squint, the weathered skin that belonged to outdoor work regardless of how much of it was actual. He wore, in Harlan County, a high-crowned Stetson and a heavy canvas coat over a cavalry shirt and a leather vest, and he moved through the world the way men of his size and certainty always move, as if the space was already arranged for them, not by arrogance but by a kind of settled inevitability. He had been brought to the county by a local contact of McLaglin's, a man named Earl Compton who ran a modest motel on the main road outside the county seat and who had served as a location scout on 2 previous productions. Wayne was staying at Compton's motel, in the end unit, 3 rooms including a small sitting room, and he was using Harlan as a base to drive the surrounding country and see what was there. What he found, as he found in most places that were working places, was a county with a texture and a set of human particulars that no amount of prior description had fully prepared him for. He drove the hollow roads in a rented Ford pickup, alone most mornings, looking at the ridgelines and the creek courses and the old farms tucked into the bottomlands. He was not sentimental about poverty. He had grown up adjacent to it and had spent decades among people for whom struggle was not a narrative but a condition. He looked at what he saw with the flat attention of a man who is trying to understand rather than feel. He had passed Redbird Creek Road 3 times in the first week, on his way to and from the higher roads that crossed toward Leslie County. He had noticed the Dillard farm the way he noticed all the farms on that road: the shape of the house, the condition of the outbuildings, the placement of the woodpile that tells a person whether a family is ahead of the cold or behind it. He had not stopped. On the afternoon of January the 12th, he stopped at the small general store and filling station at the junction of the main road and Redbird Creek Road, a place called Hoskins Store, operated by a man named Delbert Hoskins who had run it since 1947. Wayne bought a Coca-Cola and a package of crackers and stood at the counter and talked in the way he talked to most people in most places, not performing, not drawing attention, just a man in a room asking questions in a tone that made questions feel like ordinary conversation. He asked about the country up the creek road. Delbert Hoskins, who was 61 and had seen a great deal come through that junction over the years, talked for 15 minutes without noticing who he was talking to. He talked about the farms up the hollow, the Combs family and the Bakers and the Dillards. He mentioned Clara Dillard, the widow woman, he said, with the 2 children, and that the bank had sent notice, and that she had until February to come up with the money or lose the farm that the family had held for going on 60 years. Wayne did not react visibly. He finished the Coca-Cola. He asked how much money was in question. Hoskins said he'd heard it was close to $800, all told. Wayne set the bottle on the counter and nodded once, very slightly. He paid for the crackers. He did not ask anything else that day. He drove back to Compton's motel and sat in the chair by the window in the sitting room and looked at the ridgeline going dark against the 6 o'clock sky. He had done the arithmetic in his head before he reached the end of the store's parking lot, and the arithmetic was simple. $800 was not a number that required much contemplation from a man of his means. He had written checks larger than that for less consequential purposes in the preceding month. What required contemplation was the other part of it. He had a long-standing principle about this kind of thing, built from the same instinct that had shaped everything else in him, a conviction that the act of helping someone had to be clean, had to leave the person helped still standing on their own ground and not in someone else's debt. Public credit, his name attached to the gesture, turned the help into something else. It turned it into a transaction between him and whatever the audience was, and the person in the middle became a prop in someone else's story. He had seen enough of that in Hollywood to be permanently resolved against it. So if he was going to do this, it had to be done in a way that didn't attach his name to it. He sat with that for 2 days. He went back out driving on the 13th and again on the 14th, and he drove past the Dillard farm both times and looked at the fence line and the house and the smoke coming from the chimney, which told him someone was managing the woodpile and the stove, which told him she hadn't given up. He stopped once, just at the edge of the road, and looked at the farm for perhaps 30 seconds, the way you look at a thing when you are deciding something, and then drove on. On the 14th, he went to see Earl Compton. He sat down with Compton in the motel office and had a cup of coffee, and asked a careful set of questions about the bank and Chester Aldridge, and the mechanics of how a foreclosure proceeded in Kentucky, and what it would take to stop one at this stage. Compton, who had some practical knowledge of county business, answered what he could and referred the rest to the county clerk's office. He did not ask why Wayne was asking. Nobody moved. Then, on the morning of January the 15th, John Wayne drove to the First National Bank of Harlan at 9 in the morning, 2 hours before the bank opened to the public. He had called ahead. Compton had placed the call, using Compton's name, and Chester Aldridge had agreed to a private meeting at that hour, presumably expecting a business matter related to the film industry. Aldridge met him in the lobby and walked him back to the office. There was a moment, the moment when a man recognizes who is sitting across his desk, when Aldridge's careful composure reorganized itself around a different set of expectations. Wayne watched the reorganization happen and said nothing while it settled. Then he stated his purpose. He told Aldridge he was aware of the situation on the Dillard farm and that he wanted to know the precise amount required to satisfy the outstanding mortgage in full, principal, penalties, fees, and any other assessments that had been applied to the account. He used those words, satisfy the outstanding mortgage in full. He said it the way a man states a thing he has already decided, not asking for agreement but establishing the terms. Aldridge opened the file. He made 2 calculations on a notepad, writing with careful precision. The total outstanding balance as of the 15th of January 1960, including all accrued penalties and fees, was $741.16. He confirmed the number twice. Wayne had brought a money envelope. He set it on Aldridge's desk and counted out the money in front of the man. $750 in 50s and 20s, counted note by note onto the surface of the desk, with a deliberateness that had nothing theatrical in it. It was simply the way he did things. He paid the full amount and then he paid the $8.84 overage without comment, which brought the total to $750 even, and the remainder, $8.84, he left on the desk. Aldridge took the money without speaking for a moment. Then he said, "I'll need to write you a receipt." Wayne said, "Write the receipt to Mrs. Clara Dillard." Aldridge looked up. "This is her account. You understand, I'll need to mark the payment on her file." Wayne said, "That's what I want. Her file shows the mortgage paid in full. The receipt goes to her. There's no other record that connects my name to this transaction." Aldridge was a careful man who knew his business. He looked at the money on his desk and looked at the man across from him and understood, with the particular clarity of someone accustomed to moving money through a system, that there was nothing illegal or irregular about what was being asked. He could accept a payment for a mortgage account from a third party. He could issue the receipt in the account holder's name. He could, if the paying party requested it, keep the identity of that party out of the correspondence. What he could not control was what other people knew. Wayne understood this as well. He said, "I'll ask you to keep this quiet, not because it needs to be hidden, because she doesn't need to know someone did her a favor. She needs to know she owns her farm." Aldridge wrote the receipt. He drafted it on bank letterhead, a notification to Clara May Dillard that the mortgage note on the property at Redbird Creek Road, Harlan County, Kentucky, had been satisfied in full as of January 15, 1960, and that the lien on the property was hereby released. He signed it. He had his cashier, a woman named Edna Pruitt who had been with the bank since 1953, witness and countersign it. Edna Pruitt, for her part, saw exactly what was on the desk and said nothing. Wayne folded the receipt and put it in the envelope and sealed it. He wrote Clara Dillard's name on the outside and her rural route address below it. He said, "Mail this today." Aldridge said he would. Wayne stood. He put his hat back on with the unhurried motion of a man who has finished his business. At the door he stopped and turned once, not dramatically, just the turn of a man who has remembered one more thing, and said, She made 14 years of payments on that note, every one of them on time. Your institution ought to remember that the next time someone in her situation asks for a month. He walked out. Nobody in that lobby moved for a full 3 seconds after the door closed. Edna Pruitt looked at the door and then at Chester Aldridge, and did not say what she was thinking, which was considerable. Aldridge sat down and looked at the money on his desk, and then began the paperwork in the careful, methodical way of a man who has understood that the correct response to an extraordinary morning is to do exactly what he would do on an ordinary one. The envelope was mailed from the bank's outgoing mail that afternoon. It arrived at Clara Dillard's rural route box on the morning of January the 17th, a Saturday. Clara walked to the mailbox in the early morning, in the same path she walked every morning regardless of weather. Coat buttoned to the throat, the path worn through the snow from the back door to the fence gate to the road, and took the mail from the box and turned back toward the house, sorting through it as she walked, the way people do when the mail has mostly been bad news for a while, and they have learned to process it standing up rather than sitting down. She opened the bank envelope at the kitchen table, standing, her coat still on. She read the letter once, and then read it again, and then sat down in the chair. The mortgage was paid in full, as of January 15, 1960. $741.16. Paid, satisfied. Leanne released. She read the letter a third time, looking for the part where it was a mistake or a condition or a trap, the way a person looks for the hidden cost in something that cannot be what it appears to be. There was no hidden cost. The language was simple and straightforward and absolute. The lien was released. The farm was hers. She did not cry. That was not Clara's way. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time, holding the paper, and the kitchen was quiet except for the stove and the distant sound of James moving in the barn, and the morning light came through the window at the angle it always came at that hour, and she sat in it. After a while she got up and made breakfast because it was time for breakfast. She did not know who had paid the mortgage. The letter said only that the note had been satisfied. It gave no name. She asked no one immediately, because in those first hours she was operating on the plain fact of the thing, and not yet on the question of it. It was Ruth who noticed the coat. She had gone out to the road on Sunday morning, the 18th, to bring in the newspaper from the box, and she had come back into the house carrying not just the paper, but a heavy canvas coat that she had found hanging on the outside post of the fence gate. It was a man's coat, large, clearly large, the kind of coat a very large man wore. Heavy canvas outer shell, wool lining, the collar worn soft at the edges. Not a new coat, a coat that had been used and kept and worn by someone who valued it. Ruth brought it to her mother and laid it on the kitchen table. Clara looked at it. She picked it up and examined it. The cut, the wear pattern, the lining. There was no name in it, no tag beyond the manufacturer's label, which was too generic to identify. She looked at the pockets, which were empty. She looked at the fence gate through the kitchen window for a moment, then back at the coat. She hung it on the hook by the back door. She did not say anything to Ruth about it beyond, someone must have left it. Ruth was 17 and understood that her mother did not intend to discuss this further, and she did not push. But she thought about the coat for the rest of that day. In the county, the question of who had paid the Dillard mortgage moved at the speed of small community information, which is to say it moved quickly but incompletely. Edna Pruitt had not told anyone, but she had a husband, and she did not tell him the name, but she told him that someone had come in and paid off a widow woman's mortgage in cash and walked away without asking for credit. That was enough. By the following Monday, it was known in general terms at Hoskins' store and at the hardware store and at the counter of the Harlan Diner that someone had paid Clara Dillard's banknote in full. No one knew who. Delbert Hoskins at the Junction store thought about the tall man who had stopped in and bought crackers and asked about the farm up the road. He thought about the Stetson and the canvas coat. and the way the man had said almost nothing while Hoskins had talked for 15 minutes about the Hollow and the families in it. He thought about this for a day or two, and then he thought about it a great deal more, and eventually he arrived at a conclusion that seemed too large to say out loud, so he mostly kept it to himself, though he did mention to his wife that he had a strong feeling about who it might have been. She asked who. He told her. She looked at him for a moment and then said, "Delbert, that doesn't happen." He said, "I know." She said, "So you're wrong." He did not argue, but he kept the thought. John Wayne left Harlan County on the morning of January the 18th. He checked out of Compton's motel, paid his bill, shook Earl Compton's hand, and drove the rental truck to the airport at Knoxville. He did not stop at Hoskins' store on his way out. He did not drive past the Dillard farm. He drove the main road to the highway and was gone before 10 in the morning. Compton watched the truck go. He had pieced together what had happened. He was a man who paid attention to the movements of things in his county, and a payment of that size at that moment was not difficult to connect. But he said nothing publicly about what he thought. He was by nature a man who kept other people's business in the category of their business, which was one of the reasons Wayne had found him a useful contact. The coat stayed on the hook by Clara Dillard's back door. In the following days, as the certainty of the situation settled into the fabric of her life, the farm was hers, the note was gone. The children did not have to know how close it had been. She found herself returning, more than she would have expected, to the question of the coat. She asked, quietly, among neighbors, whether anyone had left a coat on her fence. No one claimed it. She mentioned it to Delbert Hoskins, who said he hadn't heard anything, which was technically true. She was not, by nature, a woman who left questions unanswered, but she also understood when a question had given her everything it was going to give. Whoever had paid the note and left the coat had chosen not to be known. She understood this. It was a specific kind of generosity, the kind that asks nothing back, not even gratitude. She had encountered it once before in her life, when she was 12 years old and a teacher at her school had paid the cost of her school books for a year without ever acknowledging it, and she had not known until she was an adult. She recognized the shape of the thing. She took the coat down from the hook and washed it and hung it on the line to dry in the cold January air, and then brought it back in and folded it and put it in the cedar chest. She did not throw it away, and she did not give it away. She kept it. She never spoke publicly of it. By the end of January 1960, the Dillard farm on Redbird Creek Road was operating on a footing it had not had in 14 months. Not comfortably, not without work, but soundly, with the particular solidity that comes from the absence of a threat that has been present for a very long time. Clara had no mortgage payment in February and none going forward. She had the farm outright. She used the money that had been the mortgage payment, $82 a month, to begin rebuilding the operating account, and she watched the balance in the green ledger begin, for the first time since Thomas died, to move in the direction of safety. She found additional washing work in the spring, through a different set of families, and she made a decision that spring to increase the chicken flock to 50 birds and sell eggs more formally to the general store at the junction, an arrangement Delbert Hoskins was glad to make. By June, she was clearing a modest but real income from the eggs alone. In the summer of 1960, she had the barn roof repaired, a job she had been watching worsen for 2 years and had not been able to address. She hired a man named Curtis Brock from up the road, who did the work in 3 days for $35 in labor and materials. She stood in the yard and watched him work, and when he came down off the roof at the end of the 3rd day, she gave him $35 and a jar of her apple butter, and he drove away, and she looked at the new roof for a long moment in the late afternoon light. It was the first thing she had been able to fix. She told Ruth that fall, when Ruth was preparing to enter the secretarial program at Harlan Community College, that the farm would be waiting for her and James, that it wasn't going anywhere, that whatever they decided to do with their lives, they had that to come back to. Ruth, who had lived through the previous year, understanding more than her mother knew she understood, nodded once and said, "I know, Mama." And she did know, but she hadn't known until that moment that her mother was willing to say it out loud. James turned 14 that year and took on more of the cattle work, running the ridge in the mornings before school with a matter-of-factness that would have made his father proud and that Clara watched with a mixture of grief and satisfaction she could not have fully articulated. He found out, in the way that teenagers find out about things, through the accumulated fragments of overheard conversations and the particular opacity of adults who think they're keeping secrets, that the farm had come close to being lost. He did not ask his mother about it, but he worked the ridge with a specific conscientiousness after that, as if he understood that the land had terms and he intended to honor them. There was a young man in the county named Garland Napier, 22 years old in January of 1960, who had been working at the hardware store owned by Buford Creech, one of the bank board members who had turned Clara away. Garland had heard the story of the mortgage payment from two separate people in the days after it became known in the county. The unnamed stranger, the cash on the desk, the receipt mailed to a widow with 2 children in the middle of January. He was a young man at a specific moment in the formation of his understanding of how the world worked, and the story landed in him with a weight he had not expected. He was not a sentimental person. He had grown up in a mining family in Harlan County and had not been educated toward sentiment. But something about that story, the specific, anonymous completeness of it, the way it operated entirely outside the need for acknowledgement, rearranged something in him. 3 years later, in 1963, Garland Napier started a small insurance agency in the county seat. He ran it for 40 years. He was known in those 40 years for one specific practice. He would, on occasion, advance a payment for a client who was about to lose coverage due to missed premium, advance it from his own pocket, without the client's knowledge, and recover the amount quietly over the following months. He never talked about this practice. The people who knew about it had figured it out. He never confirmed it to anyone who asked. He had told exactly one person, a younger man who worked for him in the early 1990s, and who had asked him directly where the practice came from. Garland had been quiet for a moment and then told the story as he knew it, not knowing the stranger's name, not claiming to know it, just the bare facts of what had happened in January of 1960 in Harlan County, Kentucky. A man had paid a widow's mortgage in cash and walked away. That was all. But it was enough. The young man who worked for Garland in the 1990s was named David Creech, grandson of Buford Creech, one of the bank board members. The world of a county, given enough time, tends to circle back on itself. By 1965, Clara Dillard's farm was running 12 head of cattle on the ridge and producing enough hay from the bottomland to support them through winter without buying additional feed. She had expanded the apple orchard by 14 trees, replacing the oldest ones that had stopped producing, and she was selling cider in the fall to the store at the junction and to a roadside market that had opened on the main road. She paid no one anything. The farm was hers, fully, legally, permanently hers, and she ran it with the same practical attention she had brought to everything since she was 19 years old and came to Harlan County with a cedar chest and a cast-iron skillet. Ruth had married by then, a young man from Bell County named Dennis Faulkner who worked as a county surveyor, and they had a daughter, born in 1964, named after Clara's grandmother. James had taken a job with the county road department, but worked the farm on weekends and holidays, and intended, he had made clear, to take it over when the time came. The cedar chest sat in the bedroom. Inside it, beneath the quilts and the documents and the small accumulated artifacts of Clara Dillard's life, the coat remained. She had moved it once to make room for a quilt she was storing, and had handled it briefly, and had put it back. It was a man's coat, heavy, worn, The canvas still sound despite the years. She had no idea whose it was. She had considered over the years various people it might belong to, and had dismissed each one for reasons that the coat itself seemed to argue against. It was too large for anyone she could think of. It was a working coat, not a fashion coat, but it had a quality to it, in the construction, in the wool lining, that said it had been made for someone who could afford quality. She kept it the way she kept all important things, without drama, without excessive attachment, simply as a fact of her life that did not require an explanation to be worth preserving. In the summer of 1979, Ruth's daughter, named Clara after her grandmother but called Clary by everyone who knew her, was 15 years old and spending the summer at the farm on Redbird Creek Road. She was a curious girl, a reader, the kind of teenager who went through the contents of old boxes with the specific interest of someone who believed that the past had not finished speaking. She found the coat in the cedar chest on a rainy afternoon in July, when the ridge was socked in with cloud, and the television signal was poor and there was nothing to do but be inside with the old things. She brought it to her grandmother and asked about it. Clara was sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, 60 years old that year, her hair gone to silver, her hands the hands of a woman who had worked with them for 40 years. She took the coat from Clary and held it for a moment and said what she always said. Someone left it on the fence, in January of 1960, the same week that the farm was saved. Clary said, "Saved from what?" Clara told her, in the measured, factual way she told all stories, without embellishment, the exact amounts and the exact dates and the exact sequence of events. The mortgage, the crisis, the final notice, the letter that had arrived from the bank saying it was paid. The coat on the fence the next day, the name she had never been given. Clary listened without interrupting. Then she said, "And you never found out who it was?" Clara said, "No." Clary held the coat. "Do you think someone knows?" Clara said, "Probably someone knows. Or knew. People who were here then are old now or gone." She paused. The knowing doesn't change the thing. Clary thought about that. She was 15 and not sure she agreed, but she was also 15 and not sure she should say so. She put the coat back in the chest. She did not forget the story. In the spring of 1984, when she was 20 years old and studying history at Eastern Kentucky University in Richmond, Clary Faulkner began, as a personal project outside her coursework, to research the question she had never entirely put down. She was not a credulous person. She understood that memory in small communities collects legends the way a post collects vines. But she was also a historian by training and inclination, and the story her grandmother had told her had the texture of fact, specific, verifiable, dated, and she wanted to follow it where it led. She found Delbert Hoskins, retired but still living at the Junction, now in his mid-80s. She drove out to see him on a Saturday in April of 1984. He remembered the tall man in the Stetson. He remembered the crackers and the Coca-Cola and the questions about the farm up the road. He said what he had said to his wife in 1960 and been told could not be true. He said it again, to Clary, with the particular firmness of a man who has held an opinion for 24 years and has gotten more certain about it with time, not less. She found a record in the Harlan County Motel Registry for January 1960, Earl Compton's Motel, that listed a guest under a business name associated with a production company. The connection was indirect. It was not proof. She found a photograph in the local newspaper archive from the main street of Harlan, dated January 14, 1960, taken during a county council meeting that had nothing to do with any of this. In the background of the photograph, through the window of the diner across the street, there was the outline of a very large man in a high-crowned hat. The photograph was black and white, and the figure was at distance, and the resolution of a 1960 small-town newspaper did not resolve the question. She put her research in a folder and kept it. She had not proven anything. What she had proven was that the story had the specific, detailed consistency of something that had actually happened, and that at least one person who had been present believed, with quiet certainty, that he knew who had done it. She graduated in 1986 and became a high school history teacher in Richmond, Kentucky. She taught there for 30 years. She told the story once a year in her American history class, not as a verified fact, but as a documented example of a thing that might be true, and that she had spent time trying to understand. She told her students, "This is what it looks like when a person helps someone without needing credit. This is the exact shape of it." She kept the folder. Clara Dillard died in September of 1991, at the age of 71, in the house on Redbird Creek Road. She had lived there for 52 years. She had been a widow for 33 of them. She had never remarried, not from lack of opportunity, but from the same self-sufficient practicality that had defined everything else she did. She had her farm and her children and her work and her green ledger, which she kept until the end, and she had not needed any arrangement she did not choose. James took over the farm as he had always said he would. He was 45 years old and had been working it alongside his mother for most of his adult life. He ran 20 head of cattle by then and had a hay operation that sold to 3 neighboring farms in season. He had a wife and 2 sons. The house was the same house, repaired and maintained over the decades, but unmistakably the same house. The same stovepipe, the same root cellar, the same apple orchard on the ridge, now carrying the trees that Clara had planted in 1960, alongside the ones her father-in-law had put in during the original settlement. At the estate, when James and Ruth went through the cedar chest, they found the coat. Ruth held it and told her daughter, who was there, what she knew of the story from her own memory: the coat on the fence, the Sunday morning, the mortgage paid by an unknown hand. James had known the outline of the story, but had never handled the coat himself. He held it for a moment and then put it back in the chest without speaking. They kept it. The deed to the farm, dated with the satisfaction of the mortgage on January 15, 1960, was in the cedar chest as well, in the folder where Clara had kept all important papers. The receipt from First National Bank of Harlan was with it, the one that said the lien had been released, signed by Chester Aldridge and witnessed by Edna Pruitt. No other name on it, just the clear, final language of a thing discharged. The mortgage note on the property at Redbird Creek Road had been satisfied in full. James had it framed. He hung it in the front room of the farmhouse, on the wall beside the window that looks out toward the barn. Visitors who asked about it got the story in whatever version James or his sons or their children chose to tell on that particular day. Shorter in some tellings, longer in others. The unknown benefactor always the same shape in every version. A large man, a cold January, a coat on the fence. By 2003, the Dillard farm had been in continuous family operation for 100 years. James's son Thomas, named for the grandfather he had never met, had taken over the daily operations and was running it as a combination cattle and small crop operation, with 31 head of Angus and a market garden component that supplied a farmer's market in the county seat from April through October. The apple orchard on the ridge still bore fruit every September. Some of the trees Clara had planted in 1960 were still producing. The framed receipt was still on the wall. It had become, in the way that family documents sometimes do, the organizing artifact of a family's sense of itself. Not a trophy, but a marker, a thing that said, "Here is where the line held." Visitors to the farm over the years, neighbors, friends of the younger Dillards, the occasional journalist or student who had heard some version of the story, looked at the receipt and were told what it meant. January 15, 1960, satisfied in full, a name no one could attach. The coat was still in the cedar chest, though the chest itself had been moved from the bedroom to the front room years ago, and served now as a piece of furniture rather than active storage. When James's grandchildren opened it, as grandchildren always open old chests, drawn by the particular gravity of old things, they found the coat still there, folded, the canvas still sound, the wool lining soft from the decades. It was a very large coat. Everyone who handled it remarked on that. It was a coat made for a man of exceptional size, and the cut of it and the quality of the lining spoke to a coat that had been worn with intent rather than chosen carelessly. Whatever man had taken it off and left it on a fence post in the dark of a January night in 1960 had been a man who valued what he carried. He had left the thing he valued because someone else had greater need of it, and then he had gotten in a truck and driven away on a frozen road and not looked back. The story ends there, in the only way this kind of story can end, not with the hero, but with what the hero left behind. The framed receipt hangs on the wall of the farmhouse on Redbird Creek Road in Harlan County, Kentucky. The apple orchard planted in 1960 bore fruit again last September. The coat folded in the cedar chest is older now than most of the people who know the story, and no one who has heard it, not once, in any version, in any telling, has ever needed to know whose name was on the payment to understand exactly what kind of man it was who made it.